My ex-husband thought he'd won. He sat across from me in that courtroom wearing the same smug smile he used to wear at our breakfast table every morning for 15 years. Confident. Relaxed. Already planning what he'd do with my house, my work, and my silence. He didn't know the papers in front of him weren't a victory, they were a financial execution order he'd signed himself. Then his lawyer leaned in and whispered 5 words. Just 5. And Vincent Mercer's face went completely white. His hands started shaking. The papers trembled like leaves in a storm. And for the first time in 3 years, I smiled. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because to understand how a woman everyone thought was weak, broken, and discarded pulled off the longest, quietest revenge imaginable, you need to know how I got here. My name is Alexis Dunst. I'm 34 years old. Until 3 months ago, I was married to Vincent Mercer for 15 years. I helped build his business, raised our son, ran his finances, and kept his entire life from falling apart, while everyone assumed I was just the wife. They thought I lost everything in the divorce. What they didn't know was that I'd been waiting for this moment for 3 years. When people hear my ex-husband's name, they usually nod with admiration. Vincent Mercer. Real estate developer. Self-made. Charismatic. The kind of man who shook hands firmly and looked people straight in the eye. For 15 years, I stood beside him while that image solidified, brick by brick. What no one ever noticed was that I was the one holding the blueprint. We met when we were 19. I was working 2 jobs and taking night classes, obsessed with stability because I'd grown up without it. Vincent had confidence but no plan. He talked big, dreamed bigger, and relied on charm to fill the gaps where discipline should have been. Somehow, that worked, especially once I stepped in. I organized his life before I even realized that's what I was doing. Calendars, bills, emails, follow-ups. I turned chaos into structure, quietly. When we married, everyone said I was lucky. Vincent was ambitious. Vincent was driven. Vincent was going places. And to be fair, he did, because I made sure he could. I balanced accounts, negotiated with contractors, handled late-night paperwork after our son went to sleep. I learned real estate terminology without ever being on the deed. I filed taxes without my name on the business. I made phone calls pretending to be his assistant, smoothing over mistakes he never knew existed. At dinner parties, people praised him. They'd joke that I must be so proud. I smiled, sipped my wine, and nodded. No one asked what I did. No one wondered how deals closed on time or why crises never reached Vincent's ears. That was my job, to absorb impact so he could shine. From the outside, we were solid. Beautiful home. Family vacations. Matching smiles on social media. Inside, though, something was off. Vincent grew distant, then entitled. He stopped asking for my input and started expecting it. If something went wrong, it was my fault. If something went right, it was his achievement. I told myself this was normal. This was marriage. This was partnership. The illusion held for years because I helped maintain it. I ignored red flags. I dismissed my exhaustion. I convinced myself that being indispensable meant being valued. Looking back, that belief kept me stuck longer than love ever did. People still talk about those years like they were the golden era of Vincent's success. They weren't wrong, but they were incomplete. Because behind every polished achievement was a woman doing invisible labor, believing that loyalty would be rewarded and sacrifice would be seen. It wasn't. And that illusion, the perfect marriage, the powerful man, the supportive wife, was the first thing that had to shatter before anything else could fall into place. Vincent didn't ease into the divorce conversation. There was no warning, no build-up, no late-night talk where we both cried and admitted things weren't working. He came home one Tuesday evening, loosened his tie, and said it the way someone announces a schedule change. I want a divorce. That was it. No apology. No explanation. Just a statement, delivered while he poured himself a drink like he was rewarding himself for saying it out loud. I remember standing there, frozen, trying to understand how 15 years could be reduced to 5 words. I asked him why. He shrugged. Said he was unhappy. Said we'd grown apart. Said he wanted something different. When I pressed, he looked irritated, like I was wasting his time. That's when I realized he'd already moved on emotionally. I was just late to the meeting. Within days, his tone shifted from detached to strategic. He started talking about assets, lawyers, and what made sense. He said the house was tied to his business, so it should stay with him. He said the company was his name, his risk, his future. He said I could keep personal items and focus on being a good mother. It was astonishing how quickly he reframed our shared life as something he generously allowed me to participate in. What hurt more than the divorce itself was how confidently he assumed I'd comply. He spoke to me like an employee being laid off, not a partner who'd helped build everything he stood on. When I reminded him that I'd worked for the business, he laughed, not cruelly, but dismissively. That wasn't real work, he said. You helped. Big difference. I slept on the couch that night. 2 days later, he suggested I find somewhere else to stay while things were sorted out. He said it would be less tense that way. Less tense for who? I wondered, as I packed an overnight bag under his watchful eyes. Then came the paperwork. His lawyer emailed me documents that already divided everything, as if negotiations were a formality. Vincent wanted the house, the business, the accounts. I was offered a modest settlement and primary custody of our son, framed as a favor rather than a responsibility. The humiliation was quiet but constant. Vincent told friends we were amicably separating. He told his parents I was taking it well. He told our son we'd both be happier this way. And I smiled through it all, because I hadn't yet decided how to respond. That night, alone in a borrowed guest room, I cried harder than I ever had. Not because he was leaving, but because he truly believed I would walk away empty-handed, grateful for scraps, convinced I deserved no more than what he chose to give. That was the moment something in me hardened. I didn't argue. I didn't threaten. I didn't beg. I started paying attention. If Vincent's announcement felt cold, the weeks that followed felt surgical. Precise. Efficient. Like he was removing me from his life piece by piece, careful not to disturb anything he wanted to keep. I was no longer his wife, I was an inconvenience he needed managed. His mother, Carol, wasted no time inserting herself. She called me one afternoon and told me that it would be healthier for everyone if I cleared my things out of the house quickly. She said Vincent was under a lot of stress and didn't need reminders of what wasn't working. When I asked where she thought I should go, she paused, then suggested I stay with friends. Like 15 years of marriage came with a return policy. Packing was worse than the phone calls. Carol showed up unannounced with empty trash bags. Not boxes. Bags. She said it was temporary and not to make it dramatic. I folded my clothes in silence, placing them into black plastic like evidence being disposed of. Vincent watched from the doorway, arms crossed, saying nothing. The man who once promised to protect me couldn't even meet my eyes. Within a week, I was out. No keys. No access to accounts. My name was still technically on the mortgage, but I couldn't step inside. Vincent framed it as a boundary. I experienced it as exile. I moved between couches, spare rooms, and one particularly humiliating week in a budget motel while I figured out next steps. Then came the girlfriend. Her name was Lila. She was younger, polished, and appeared on Vincent's social media barely a month after I left. She posted photos from my kitchen, holding my mug, smiling like she'd discovered something new. Friends texted me awkward condolences, then slowly stopped checking in. Discomfort has a way of thinning relationships. The isolation was complete when Vincent cut off access to our shared funds. My card declined at a grocery store while I was standing with our son. The cashier looked at me with pity. I paid in cash I'd borrowed and cried in the car afterward, hands shaking on the steering wheel. Through all of this, Vincent told everyone I was struggling to let go. He framed my silence as instability. He implied I was emotional, overwhelmed, maybe even irresponsible. And the worst part? People believed him. Not because I was wrong, but because he sounded confident. At night, I replayed everything. Wondered how I'd missed this version of him. Wondered how easily he erased me. I felt small, replaceable, embarrassed. Like my entire life had been a warm-up act for someone else's future. But even in that isolation, something important was happening. While Vincent assumed I was breaking down, I was observing. While he celebrated his freedom, I was documenting patterns. Who said what? Who did what? Which accounts disappeared? Which stories didn't line up? They thought humiliation had weakened me. In reality, it had given me clarity. And clarity, I would soon learn, is far more dangerous than anger. The truth is, my plan didn't begin when Vincent asked for a divorce. It began 3 years earlier, on a quiet Sunday morning that still plays in my head with unsettling clarity. Vincent was out golfing with clients, and I was doing what I always did, reviewing numbers. He called it, my little system. I called it responsibility. I had access to the business accounts because Vincent hated details. He trusted me to handle it, the same way he trusted breaks to work without knowing how they did. That morning, something didn't add up. A transfer amount was off by just enough to bother me. I followed the trail, expecting a simple error. It wasn't. What I found was a web of debt so dense it made my stomach drop. Credit lines stacked on top of each other. Second and third mortgages taken out quietly. Loans shifted between entities to disguise their weight. On paper, Vincent looked wildly successful. In reality, the business was propped up by borrowed time and borrowed money. The worst part wasn't the debt itself, it was how deliberately it had been hidden. Statements rerouted. Notifications disabled. Payments shuffled to avoid detection. This wasn't carelessness. It was deception. Vincent wasn't just reckless. He was lying, and he'd been doing it for years. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my laptop, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, feeling like the ground had tilted beneath me. My first instinct was to confront him. Demand explanations. Insist on transparency. But something stopped me. Instinct. I realized then that Vincent didn't see me as an equal. If I confronted him, he'd minimize, manipulate, or gaslight. He'd say I misunderstood. He'd accuse me of being dramatic. And if I pushed too hard, he'd shut me out completely. I'd lose access, and with it, the truth. So I did the opposite. I said nothing. Instead, I started documenting. Quietly. I made copies of statements and saved them in places Vincent would never look. I learned which debts were personal and which were tied to the business. I traced signatures. I noted dates. I didn't act emotional. I acted methodical. I also protected what little was truly mine. My inheritance from my grandmother. My retirement account. I moved them legally, carefully, into a trust Vincent couldn't touch. Not out of revenge, but survival. I knew that when things eventually collapsed, I couldn't afford to be collateral damage. For 3 years, I carried that knowledge alone. I watched Vincent posture at parties, boast about growth, make promises he couldn't keep. I smiled, nodded, and let him believe the illusion was intact. By the time he asked for a divorce, I already knew what he didn't. He thought he was cutting me loose. In reality, he was walking away from the only person who understood the full scope of his financial reality, and the only one who could navigate it safely. The discovery didn't make me powerful overnight. But it made me patient. And patience, in the end, would be everything. Once I understood the depth of Vincent's financial situation, everything changed, not outwardly, but internally. I stopped seeing myself as the woman being abandoned and started seeing myself as the woman who knew the ending long before the story reached its climax. From that point on, every move I made was intentional. I didn't drain accounts or confront him. That would have raised alarms. Instead, I focused on insulation. I met quietly with a financial advisor under the guise of long-term planning. I asked questions carefully, never revealing the full picture, just enough to confirm what I already suspected. The business was unstable. One wrong move, one exposed liability, and it would fold inward like a collapsing tent. The most important step was protecting my son. I created a trust in his name, funded with my inheritance and a portion of savings Vincent had never paid attention to. Everything was documented, legal, and unassailable. It wasn't hidden, it was secured. If Vincent ever noticed, it would already be too late to challenge. I also started building a personal paper trail. I emailed myself summaries of conversations. I kept a dated journal of financial irregularities. I photographed documents before returning them to their folders. It felt paranoid at times, but experience had taught me that men like Vincent rewrote history when it suited them. I wasn't going to rely on memory when evidence could speak louder. Outwardly, I played my role perfectly. Supportive wife. Calm partner. I listened when Vincent complained about pressure and reassured him when deals got shaky. I encouraged his confidence, knowing it made him careless. He assumed my silence meant ignorance. It was an assumption that would cost him dearly. When the divorce announcement finally came, I wasn't shocked. I was prepared. While Vincent believed he was orchestrating a clean break, I was already several steps ahead. I hired my own lawyer quietly, one with experience in complex asset division and debt exposure. I told her everything. She didn't look surprised, only impressed by my restraint. Her advice was simple: wait. Let Vincent believe he was winning. Let him push for ownership. Let him insist on control. The more he claimed, the more responsibility he'd unknowingly assume. I didn't need to take from him. I needed him to take from himself. So when negotiations began, I asked for very little. A modest settlement. Custody arrangements. Nothing that raised suspicion. Vincent grew confident, even smug. He thought I was conceding out of fear. In truth, I was laying the groundwork for the cleanest escape imaginable. I wasn't preparing to fight him. I was preparing to let him fight gravity, alone. And gravity, unlike anger, is impossible to argue with. Mediation was where the performance truly began. By then, Vincent had fully embraced the narrative that I was defeated. He walked into those sessions relaxed, smiling too much, speaking as if everything had already been decided. I let him believe that. In fact, I encouraged it. I dressed simply. I spoke softly. When lawyers discussed assets, I asked clarifying questions that made me sound uncertain rather than informed. I apologized when conversations got tense. I thanked Vincent for being fair. Every word was deliberate. Confidence makes people cautious. Vulnerability makes them careless. Vincent's lawyer, a sharp woman with tired eyes, studied me closely. She asked more questions than Vincent liked. She suggested valuations. She warned him about liabilities. Each time, he waved her off. He said he wanted this over quickly. He said I wasn't going to contest anything. He said, she just wants to move on. He wasn't entirely wrong. I did want to move on, just not in the way he imagined. When it came time to divide property, Vincent insisted on keeping the house and the business in full. He framed it as practical. He said selling would be disruptive. He said I didn't want the stress of managing real estate anyway. I nodded. I agreed. I told him I trusted his judgment. Inside, I was counting. Every asset he demanded came with an invisible anchor: loans, credit lines, obligations. I knew exactly how heavy they were. Vincent didn't. He saw numbers. I saw timelines. My lawyer and I communicated in glances and brief pauses. She would raise a concern. I would say I didn't want to fight. Vincent would sigh with relief. Each concession made him bolder. He started pushing harder, asking for more, insisting on full ownership of accounts tied to the business. At one point, his lawyer suggested splitting certain debts. Vincent laughed and said that wouldn't be necessary. He said he could handle it. He said I shouldn't be burdened. The irony nearly made me smile. I kept my emotions contained. I never raised my voice. I never corrected him when he misstated facts. Letting someone believe a lie is often easier than forcing them to confront the truth, especially when the truth threatens their ego. By the final session, Vincent was almost giddy. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, convinced he'd outmaneuvered me. He thought my quiet meant surrender. He thought my politeness meant weakness. What he didn't realize was that the agreement in front of him wasn't a win. It was a trap he'd designed himself. All I had to do was let him step into it willingly. And sign. Which he did, without hesitation. The performance was over. The consequences were just beginning. The courtroom was colder than I expected. Not physically, but emotionally, sterile, quiet, stripped of drama. Vincent sat beside his lawyer, tapping his pen like he was bored. He looked confident, almost smug, the way people do when they believe the worst is already behind them. I sat on the other side, hands folded, breathing evenly, waiting. When the judge entered, everything slowed. Papers were shuffled. Names were called. The agreement Vincent had pushed so hard for was placed on record. The same agreement he'd rushed through mediation, barely skimming the details. I watched his expression as the judge began to summarize. Assets to Vincent Mercer: the house, the business entities, the investment properties, associated accounts. Liabilities to Vincent Mercer: all debts, loans, credit lines, and financial obligations tied to said assets. The words landed one by one, each heavier than the last. Vincent's pen stopped tapping. I saw the shift before he did, the slight stiffening of his shoulders, the way his brow furrowed as comprehension tried to catch up with reality. His lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently now, her earlier confidence replaced by concern. Vincent shook his head, still not fully understanding. Then the judge clarified. The total debt exceeded the assets by a significant margin. The business, while impressive on paper, was over-leveraged. The house was mortgaged multiple times. The investments were underwater. The agreement, as written and signed, transferred full ownership and full responsibility to Vincent. Silence filled the room. Vincent's face drained of color. His mouth opened, then closed. He looked at me, finally really looking, as if searching for confirmation that this was some kind of mistake. I met his gaze calmly. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply existed. His lawyer stood and tried to object, arguing misunderstanding, imbalance, lack of disclosure. The judge shut it down quickly. Vincent had representation. He had time. He had signed willingly. The court wasn't there to protect him from his own decisions. That was the moment Vincent broke. His hands shook as he gathered the papers he'd once treated like trophies. The confidence was gone, replaced by something raw and panicked. He whispered questions to his lawyer she couldn't answer anymore. When it was over, the judge finalized the decree. The gavel struck. 15 years ended in seconds. Outside the courtroom, Vincent tried to speak to me. I didn't stop. I didn't owe him closure. The justice I wanted wasn't emotional, it was structural. It was fair. For years, Vincent had built his life on the assumption that I would clean up his messes. That I would absorb risk so he could chase reward. That assumption ended in that courtroom. I walked out lighter than I'd felt in years, not because I'd won something from him, but because I'd finally stopped carrying what was never mine to begin with. And for the first time, Vincent had to face the weight of his choices alone. The collapse didn't happen all at once. It never does. Vincent's life unraveled slowly, the way things fall apart when there's no one left holding them together. At first, he insisted everything was fine. He told mutual friends the court outcome was temporary and that he had a plan. But plans require stability, and stability was the one thing he no longer had. The business faltered within months. Vendors demanded payments. Creditors stopped being patient. Deals fell through when due diligence exposed the debt he'd buried for years. The same confidence that once impressed people now made them cautious. Charm doesn't work when numbers are undeniable. Lila didn't stay. She disappeared quietly, taking her belongings and her curated photos with her. I heard about it secondhand, not because I was looking for updates, but because people suddenly felt comfortable telling the truth around me. Vincent was no longer untouchable. He was human, and visibly struggling. As for me, life became smaller, but steadier. I rented a modest apartment near my son's school. We cooked dinner together. We talked. Really talked. I didn't rush to replace what I'd lost because I wasn't interested in recreating old patterns. Peace, I learned, doesn't need to be impressive. Financially, I rebuilt slowly. I took a consulting job, using the skills I'd spent years sharpening in the background. Organization. Analysis. Crisis management. The things no one noticed when I did them for free suddenly had value. I earned my own income and kept it separate. That independence felt like oxygen. Vincent filed for bankruptcy within a year. I felt nothing when I heard. No triumph. No satisfaction. Just distance. His choices had finally caught up with him, and I wasn't part of that story anymore. What stayed with me was the lesson. Strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it looks like patience. Like silence. Like letting someone underestimate you while you quietly secure your future. People still ask how I managed to stay so calm during the divorce. I tell them the truth, I wasn't calm because I was weak. I was calm because I was prepared. Today, my life isn't flashy. It's grounded. My son is safe. My finances are clean. My home is mine. And the most important thing, I trust myself again. Vincent once believed I was something he could discard. In reality, I was the foundation he never bothered to understand. When that foundation stepped away, everything he built collapsed. And I walked forward, free, intact, and finally living a life that belongs entirely to me. I didn't walk away with his house, his company, or his reputation. I walked away with something far more valuable, my freedom. For years, I was the invisible support system holding everything together, mistaken for someone replaceable. When I finally stepped aside, the illusion collapsed under its own weight. I didn't need to destroy him. I simply stopped saving him. And in doing so, I proved something to myself and to my son: strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it waits patiently, documents carefully, and leaves quietly, while consequences do all the talking.